Now it is my honor to introduce Philip Tabas, whose presentation is entitled 70 Years of Protecting Nature, the Nature Conservancy's Evolving Approaches to Conservation. Philip Tabas is Special Advisor with the North American Conservation Region of the Nature Conservancy based in Arlington, Virginia. He served as the Conservancy's General Counsel from 2003 to 2013. He has also held a range of legal and non-legal positions in TNC in the areas of land protection, government relations, compatible economic development, and conservation planning. Philip has been with the Conservancy for 40 years. Philip has been involved in numerous private land conservation and compatible economic development projects, particularly involving the use of conservation easements in the United States and in other countries. He has worked to secure tax incentive policy and legislative changes for conservation at the US federal and state levels of government, as well as in other countries. Prior to the Nature Conservancy, he practiced law with a private law firm, worked as an attorney for the New England River Basins Commission, a government water resources management agency, and was an attorney with an environmental consulting firm. Philip is a tax lawyer and a land use planner by professional training. He holds degrees in English literature from Pennsylvania State University, a Juris Doctor from George Washington University Law School, an LLM in tax law from Boston University Law School, and a master's degree in city planning from the University of Pennsylvania. He is a member of the American College of Environmental Lawyers, a member of the Board of Directors of the Potomac Conservancy, a member of the Board of Directors of Friends of Herring River, a co-author of Comprehensive Planning and the Environment, published by ABT Books, and he teaches a summer course entitled Ecosystem Conservation Strategies at the Vermont Law School. Philip and his wife, Helen Hooper, have been members of Temple Mica for the past 18 years. With a last reminder to keep muted and post your questions for the speaker, sending them to everyone through the chat function, I am very pleased now to turn the floor over to our distinguished speaker, Philip Tabas.
Well, thank you, Nancy. That was a very generous introduction, and I very much appreciate it. And I'm very happy to be here today with you. I really appreciated the responsive reading, which was very appropriate, and especially the reference to the planting of the tree for the 70 years, which is the same life of the Nature Conservancy, which I'll talk more about. So without further ado, I'll share my screen and hopefully be able to find the PowerPoint presentation. So the title of my talk is to give you a perspective on the work that the Nature Conservancy has done since its founding, which is 70 years ago. And I'd like to start by giving you a brief history of the conservation movement, tell you a little bit about the Nature Conservancy's history and give you a profile of the organization, talk about some conservation projects, and then close with some current issues facing our conservation activities. So there are 4 themes I want you to remember as we go through this. And I hope that the examples that I show will demonstrate the themes that have been evident in conservation practice over the years. One has to do with whether or not we're doing nature conservation for purely nature preservation perspectives or protecting nature for the benefit to people. Another is the evolution of our conservation thinking from trying to protect species to habitats and thus increase the scale of our conservation work. The third has to do with the strategies we use, whether or not it's acquiring land for our ownership as preserves versus trying to influence the activities of others. And that goes to the question of how big an impact we're trying to have. And then finally, I'd like to touch on the issue of climate change and conservation. So just to give you this to start with a brief history of conservation, the first person I want to call attention to is George Perkins Marsh, who in 1864 published a book by the name of Man and Nature. And this was one of the first books to call attention to the issue of conservation and the impact of man's activities on nature. He talked in writing that book about the activities that man was having on changing climate. So he was a very early thinker having to do with climate change. And his activities led to the creation of the Adirondack Park. The next person who I want to call your attention to is John Muir. He was a naturalist, an author, and an early advocate for wilderness preservation. He represents the school of conservation thought seeking to protect nature for its own sake, for its spiritual values, and for the inherent values of nature. Muir helped found the Sierra Club in 1892, and he's most widely known for his advocacy to help create the Yosemite National Park in 1890. The next person I'd call your attention to is Theodore Roosevelt, who is known as one of the early conservationists, known for his conservation legacy. During his tenure, he helped create 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, 55 national wildlife refuges, and 150 national forests. But unlike Muir, who wanted to protect nature for its own sake, Roosevelt believed that conservation of land and natural resources were basically for the benefit of trying to provide the most good for the most people. And here is a picture of one of the few times that Roosevelt and Muir were able to get together. They spent 3 nights in a camping trip in Yosemite, and the books have been written about that 3-night camping trip, and you can only imagine the kind of debate that they had between their differing schools of thought. This is a picture of Gifford Pinchot, who is another early conservationist. Gifford Pinchot was a close friend of Roosevelt, and he gave voice to Roosevelt's philosophy of using conservation to ensure that land was used for its productive purposes, but protected as well. He's best known for his contributions to the practice of professional forestry and to public land management. He was also the first head of the U.S. Forest Service and later served as the governor of Pennsylvania. Now, I included this slide because another factor influencing conservation was the early, in the 19th century fashion in which actual bird feathers were used for women's hats and millinery. This spurred the exploitation of a number of bird populations, including the snowy egret that's shown on the other side of the picture. And according to one estimate, 5 million egrets were killed for such hats in 1 year. The concern with the impact on bird populations led to the formation of the Massachusetts Audubon Society in 1896, and then to the creation of the National Audubon Society in 1905. And in terms of protected areas, this is a picture of the first national wildlife refuge called Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge. And there's a picture of a pelican on the left side and the picture of the refuge on the right. This was the first national wildlife refuge created in 1903 under Teddy Roosevelt's authorization, and it's located in Florida near Cape Canaveral. The next thing I'd like to call your attention to is the creation of the world's, not just in the US, but the world's first national park, Yellowstone National Park, obviously. And this was created in 1872 under President U.S. Grant. And this was, by protecting this national park, it gave a big boost to the establishment of protected area conservation throughout the world. And that led obviously to the protection and the establishment of the National Park Service, which ultimately was created in 1916 and now has about 400 units in the National Park Service. And Wallace Stegner is known for referring to the creation of the national parks as America's best idea. And Ken Burns had this wonderful PBS show to talk about it. In 1915, the Ecological Society of America was founded, and it was devoted to ecological research to preserve natural areas. And this is a picture of Victor Shelford, one of the early founders of that society. Victor Shelford was an activist and researcher, and he tried to establish the activist wing of the Ecological Society of America, and I'll mention how that relates to the Nature Conservancy in another slide. And any history of conservation would not be complete if I didn't mention the fact of the 1970s during the term of Richard Nixon, in which the landmark environmental laws were created and established. The National Environmental Policy Act, the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, and the creation of the Council for Environmental Quality and EPA. So that was a very quick overview of conservation history, and it just shows you the dichotomy between the school of thought of conservation for protecting nature for nature's sake versus protecting nature for people. So now I'd like to turn our attention to a brief history of the Nature Conservancy. And as I mentioned earlier, a small group of people from the Ecological Society in 1946 formed the Ecologist Union, which was the activist branch of the society, which led in 1950 to the creation of the Nature Conservancy. And in 1954, we created the first chapter of the Nature Conservancy, and that led to, we have chapters in every state in the country and in other parts of the world as well. Our first land acquisition project was in 1955, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. First government co-op project in which we worked with government agencies to protect land was in 1966. We will talk a little bit more about the Natural Heritage Network, and in 1980, we began to work internationally. And then in 1989, we established the Parks and Peril program to bring resources to help create protected areas in South and Central America, and we began to do more work in the international arena in the 1990s. And I'll mention that in 1995, we began to shape our conservation thinking, which I'll talk more about in a minute. In 1999, the Nature Conservancy's membership passed 1 million. We began to establish campaigns to raise $1 billion for conservation and preservation. We established a fire learning network to bring fire management to our conservation lands. And we began to establish goals to protect every major habitat type by 2015. And we later in the 2015-2017, we began to shape our conservation thinking in something called the Shared Conservation Agenda, which I'll mention in a minute. And I want to just take a minute to show you how the evolution of our thinking has changed over the years from a change in our mission statement. In the 50s, it was our mission was dedicated to saving America's heritage of wild places, to preserve natural areas as living museums. This shows you that the pure focus of our work on natural areas. And in the 1960s, our mission was changed to focus on saving land areas. And in the 70s, our mission changed to become using private action to protect land and to accomplish land conservation. The 1980s, we were committing to the global preservation of natural diversity. We still had the view that we're trying to protect nature for nature's sake. And then in the 1990s to the 2010s, we began to change some of the focus of our work to protecting natural communities that represent the diversity of life by protecting the lands and waters they need to survive. And today, our mission is to conserve the lands in which all life depends. And when we talk about all life depends, we talk about both nature and people, as we'll see in a minute. This is a picture of where the Nature Conservancy works throughout the world. And just in terms of the Nature Conservancy by the numbers, we have more than 4,000 employees and working in 72 countries. We have over 100 million acres protected, about 5,000 miles of rivers protected. we're supported by more than 1 million members, and we have more than 500 staff staff scientists working on staff. Most of our preserves are located in the United States, and as you can see, the biggest number of preserves we have are in the Northeast, given the fact that that's where some of our historical work began. In terms of the Nature Conservancy's DNA, we like to think of ourselves as being science-based, non-confrontational, nonpartisan. We try to provide on-the-ground results. We rely on volunteer support. We have 1,700 chapter trustees throughout the US and the world to help support the work we do. While we act locally, we plan and try to organize our work globally, and we work largely through partnerships. So just to give you a sense of going from the changes in the scale of our impact, as we talked about, I want to just mention how the Nature Conservancy's focus on science has changed over the years. I mentioned earlier that in the early days of the Nature Conservancy, we helped establish something called the Natural Heritage Programs, which are databases of information about the location of rare plants and animals that were located by state, as you see on the left-hand side of the screen. Over time, we began to understand that just protecting those specific places would not be sufficient, and we had to organize our information by ecoregions, which are areas that have some ecologically integrity in and of themselves, and try to focus our conservation activity to represent the ecology of those ecoregions. And we developed a methodology for carrying out our conservation work called Conservation by Design, in which we tried to identify priorities based on the conservation science, develop our strategies, then take action and measure our results. And it is a continuous circle to try to adaptively manage the conservation work that we're doing on the ground. Currently, we have updated that into something called our shared conservation agenda, in which we're trying to solve the biggest threats to nature, and at the same time that we try to improve the lives of people that rely on nature for their well-being. So here you see our vision, a world where people and nature thrive. We have 3 different strategies, and we work in these different priority areas: protecting land and water, tackling climate change, providing food and water sustainably, and building healthy cities. And as part of the shared conservation agenda, we have taken steps to try to create metrics which you see on the right-hand side of the screen, to measure our progress, to be able to say that we've actually accomplished these goals. So to make the point that the scale of our work has changed, from the 1950s, you can see that we were focused on rare plants and preserves. And now we have changed the conservation science and priority setting protocols that we used to focus on ecoregions and habitat types to guide the conservation work that we do. So now I want to turn our attention to some of the projects and activities that the Nature Conservancy has undertaken to show you how those themes that I mentioned earlier play out in project activity. So the first theme I want to mention is, again, the distinction between our conservation work focusing on nature versus people. One of the early projects we did was in the Clinch River in Virginia. The focus of our project work there had to do on protecting the mussels that occur in no fewer than 10 areas worldwide. And so here we acquired these 3 islands in the Clinch River for the purpose of protecting these areas, because they represent the habitat for those rare mussels. Now, a more recent project that we undertook involves the creation of what we call water funds. And what we are accomplishing is to try to protect the areas that are used to provide water supply to areas where people are living. And here you see a picture on the right-hand side of the screen of Quito, Ecuador, which is one of the first water funds that Nature Conservancy protected or created in the early 2003, I think it was. And the work here that we did was to protect the upstream area of the watershed from which the water is derived to help supply the water to the people living in the city of Quito. By protecting the upstream habitat, we were also trying to protect the natural features that exist in that watershed but that at the same time, we were providing clean drinking water to the millions of residents that live in Quito. So here you see an example of trying to provide a benefit to both nature and to people. In terms of the scale of conservation, I want to call attention to a project I mentioned earlier called the Mianus River Gorge Preserve, which is located at the border of New York and Connecticut, just north of Stamford, Connecticut. And here you see a map of the preserve, which is about 500 acres now, but originally when it was acquired, the people who tried to acquire it acquired about 75 acres. And this was a group of neighbors that got together to mobilize money to buy this property that was threatened by a developer who was going to develop it. And then they essentially pledged the value of their houses to raise the capital and needed to buy the land to create the preserve that you see today. And this was an essence of the model of the Nature Conservancy that has grown up since the 1950s in all of our transactions. We have the benefit of a revolving fund that we use to purchase land, and then people raise money to contribute it back to repay that loan that we use to buy the land. And this model has stood the test of time in the Nature Conservancy. So here you see a picture of the Hemlock Gorge that was protected with the efforts of the local neighbors to protect that land. Now, I want you to compare that purchase of 75 acres in 1955 with a project that we completed in December of this past year, where the Nature Conservancy purchased 260,000 acres of land for about $75 million. And this was one of the most important tropical forests in Central and South America. And here you see a map of the location of the forest, and it adds to the protected areas that the Conservancy has been working in since the early 90s. And the purpose of this project was to protect the habitat for jaguars, and as I mentioned before, one of the last tropical forests remaining in Central and South America. The threat to this forest was, if we had not purchased it, was agricultural clearing of these forests to raise crops. And so we were able to secure a transaction for an enormous amount of money, but at a huge scale, as you can imagine, by acquiring 260,000 acres of land for $76 million. And here's a picture showing the neighboring property to the south and the property that we were able to acquire that's now protected. So in terms of moving on to the third theme about the impact of conservation, I want to go back to an early project the Nature Conservancy undertook in Connecticut as well, where we acquired what's called a conservation easement over 6 acres of salt marsh in 1961. Again, the Nature Conservancy helped a group of neighbors protect this salt marsh from the imminent development by a local developer by having the landowner convey a conservation easement to the Nature Conservancy. This property is located in the Mystic River area in Connecticut. The reason why I picked that project is the creation of that conservation easement led to the establishment of a deduction under the tax law for gifts of conservation easement in 1980. And today, that tax deduction has enabled, stimulated the creation of more than 1,400 land trusts working throughout the United States, when in 1980, there were only about 200 such land trusts working, and the protection of millions of acres of land using the conservation tool. And today, the Nature Conservancy holds 3,100 conservation easements covering about 3.5 million acres of land. And just to give you a perspective, about 1% of the acreage of the United States has been protected through the use of conservation easements. Now, that one project in the mouth of the Mystic River led to our scientists thinking about the importance of protecting entire watershed. And here we see how the protection work we did at the mouth of the Connecticut River led to our scientists thinking more about protecting ecosystem flows in the entire Connecticut River watershed. And that analysis led to the creation of the Silvio Conte National Wildlife Refuge, which was one of the first refuges involving multiple states. Heretofore, refuges were single locations, but in this case, the Silvio Conte Refuge was created in New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. And here's a map of the refuge, and there are a number of sites that have been established to contribute to the protection of the important lands and waters in that watershed. So you can see how the impact of that one project in the mouth of the Connecticut has led to the protection of an entire watershed. Now today, we use not just land acquisition strategies, but we work with indigenous people in the British Columbia project along the coast of British Columbia called the Emerald Edge. We work to protect land to prevent dams from being created. We try to use the Wild and Scenic River Act to protect watersheds. We were working in the Balkans region to deploy that strategy to protect some of the last free-flowing rivers in the Balkans. And then we use carbon markets to help finance some of the land protection work that we do throughout the world. So again, I want to show the evolution of the scale of the work that we do from easements and land protection to some of the more recent approaches of protection of whole systems and working to address the drivers of land conservation and working on policies and enabling conditions to help accomplish our conservation work. So finally, I want to mention our climate change work. And climate change, by many people's thinking, is an existential threat to our conservation activity. And so the Conservancy has taken three approaches to our climate change activity. We're trying to invest in what we call natural climate solutions or natural infrastructure strategies, in which we are trying to acquire coastal areas, wetlands, which provide buffers to storms and protection of the uplands when storms occur. By way of example, we're also working to try to encourage people to use clean energy to mitigate and to lessen the adverse impact of climate change. And the last strategy we're using is trying to use the protect and restore lands and waters through something called the 30 by 30 initiative. Some of you may have heard about the 30 by 30 initiative because it has been on President Biden's agenda. And it is a global initiative that's been adopted through the Convention on Biodiversity, which is to protect 30% of each country's land area by 2030. And the Conservancy has contributed to this effort by developing a map showing the resilient and connected lands network. And these are lands that, if they were protected, would contribute to not only the protection of the biodiversity, but would allow climate change, would allow nature to thrive in the face of climate change, because nature will adapt and move. And if these lands are protected, we believe that these lands can be protected to mitigate the impact of climate change. So our scientists have developed this map showing that lands to be protected in order to mitigate the effect of climate change. And so we believe that if we are successful at achieving the 30 by 30 initiative, we will be able to not only promote biodiversity, but also combat climate change. And the strategies that we use, which will involve working in partnership with private landowners working on agriculture or forestry, we need to be able to have them be able to use those lands in ways that are compatible with conservation, so that we think they will have benefit to local economies as well. So some of the current issues facing biodiversity have to do with, as many of you may have seen, there's more people trying to get access to nature and being outside. And so there may be more pressure on our natural resources. As I mentioned earlier, we need to think about how to protect land by working with private lands and working lands owners. These are people who are using the land productively, but we would like to see them use them in ways that are accomplish both conservation and economic benefit objectives. Another issue facing biodiversity these days has to do with the changing support that's coming from philanthropy versus impact investment. And a lot of people are now thinking about how to try to making conservation pay for itself. And then finally, there's new strategies in trying to give voice to natural features in the courts of law, and these are known as rights of nature initiatives. Another major issue is the diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice issues facing the environment, and the environment has to confront some of its environmental history, having to do with the early people who are early involved in establishing the environmental movement not being as inclusive as they might be. There's a disconnect between the use of the outdoors by African Americans and others. We need to be able to connect to Indigenous people and respect Indigenous people's rights, and to acknowledge the role that Indigenous people played in protecting these lands. So I hope I've covered the four themes that in a very quick way. And just if you're interested in further reading, the Nature Conservancy has a website, nature.org. And we have something called the Conservation Gateway on the web, which provides more detailed information. There's been a book published about the Nature Conservancy called Nature's Keeper, which if you're interested in further reading about that. And finally, if you would like to visit a preserve, there are two preserves in the neighborhood, as it were, one in Anne Arundel County, Maryland, and one in Fairfax County, Virginia, and they are also can be found on the Nature Conservancy's website. So I'll stop there. I hope I didn't go too far over time, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
Sid, you there?
I'm here, yes.
Okay.
I thought there would be a transition. Well, Philip, I was thinking as you spoke, and the magnitude of the mission of the organization began to penetrate. I was thinking that God created the universe in 6 days, and what a job he left for humanity. I guess one of the early questions is from Nancy. How do you set priorities? I mean, there is so much to be done. Do you get letters from people saying, gee, we need help here? What is the process by which an idea is elevated into a project?
Well, in the early days of the Nature Conservancy, we were very responsive to inquiries for help. And we were very opportunistic, if I might use that word, as to the projects that we undertook. But as I mentioned, the development of the natural heritage programs and the use of our ecoregional analysis, we have tried to use the science that is represented by those databases and those scientists to help guide the projects that we undertake today. So most of the work, the projects we are led to undertake are based on science priorities that tell us where are the most important places to work on to advance conservation. We used to say that we were trying to protect the areas that are the last of the least and the best of the rest. That means that we were trying to protect places where the
Philip, we lost your picture and now we've lost you.
Philip, are you there? All right, Sid, I will call him and see what's happening.
Let me suggest that we talk about the program that the temple is alerting us to at 2 o'clock today.
Good idea.
Yeah, I think if you will check your email, the temple sent a notice just before we went live here about what's happening in Jerusalem, what's being done, and what's needed. It'll be a Zoom event, and if you'll check your inbox, you'll find a link. You register, and it goes live at 2 o'clock. The program announcement says, recent days have seen a further escalation in violence in Jerusalem, even beyond what we were seeing in the past few weeks. With the violent events at Al-Aqsa Mosque, police crackdowns on Palestinian protesters, the threat of home evictions in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, and the Jerusalem Day flag march, the city is in a state of crisis. Hamas rockets have fallen Jerusalem and have been met by retaliatory attacks in Gaza. Join us for an urgent conversation co-hosted by the Union of Reform Judaism about this volatile and highly dynamic situation, with leading Palestinian and Israeli experts from Jerusalem to update us about what is happening on the ground, what Israelis and Palestinians are doing, and what we can do from afar. I think the partner with the URJ is
Sid, I think Phil's back. So.
Hello there, Phil.
Yeah,
We don't
sorry,
see-
I don't know what happened, but I guess I just got cut off there. So anyway,
Were you able to hear us?
yeah,
Okay, so I'll stop tap dancing here and get back to the questions. The first from Ed Grossman, how do the activities of the organization address issues of what has been referred to as environmental racism or environmental justice?
well, I think, as I mentioned, that the environmental movement at large has a checkered history at best of engaging with communities of color and indigenous people. And so most environmental organizations in this day and age have programs to try to rectify that. And we at the Nature Conservancy have just hired a chief diversity, equity, and inclusion officer to try to help the Nature Conservancy address those kinds of issues. And we are trying to incorporate and make integral to the way in which we actually carry out our projects concern for people of color and disadvantaged communities. And we have a program of indigenous rights, of trying to engage with indigenous communities. So I think many conservation organizations these days are taking that issue seriously and devoting a lot of resources to trying to rectify the past history.
Barbara Diskin asks, what other countries have a similar commitment to Nature Conservancy?
Well, in fact, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD Convention, is signed by all of the world's countries, and that every other country has made a commitment other than the United States. And so we are fortunate to be able to work in all other parts of the world with other countries that have made significant commitments to conservation and environmental preservation. And we're obviously fortunate to be working here with the Biden administration to be able to undertake new initiatives to protect 30 by 30 going forward. So I think the world's other countries have adopted a number of other commitments to making conservation commitments, which we're all the beneficiaries of.
And would you say the U.S. leads in this regard, or we lag some other actors?
I would say we are reclaiming our leadership position. Certainly, having rejoined the Paris Climate Treaty is a good example of that. But we are also spurring efforts in international circles to actually get the 30 by 30 commitments to be implemented actually on the ground. So I think the United States is playing begin to playing a leading role again.
Francie Schwartz asks, what other cities in addition to Quito benefit thanks to TNC projects?
So the Conservancy has taken the example in Quito, and we are now working in 30 other cities in South America to establish water funds in South America. And in this country, there are a number of initiatives. You may all be familiar with the work of to protect the Catskills, to protect the water supply for New York City. And there are other models of that example in the United States, in San Antonio, and other cities around the US. So this is an idea that has taken off, and certainly in Africa, we're promoting a number of city projects to protect upstream waters, to provide clean water to city residents. So it's taking on a life of its own.
Your presentation was chock full with lots of facts, and I'm a decent note taker, but I'm sure I missed a lot. Is it available? Can you put it in our chat or send us a link to something comparable?
Yes, I sent the link to David and Nancy, and so
Okay.
it's available. I think they want to post it on the website.
That's fine.
So you can have it.
We'll be able to share.
Okay. It's a little hard for me to get my mind around the scope of the mission of the Conservancy. I mean, we're talking globally here, and you mentioned an astounding number, 500 scientists on staff.
Right.
Does the EPA have that many?
That is a good question. I don't know what the statistics are for EPA, but we, when I started with the Nature Conservancy in 1980, there were about 200 people total. But since that time, as I mentioned in one of the slides, we have now 4,000 people working worldwide in 72 countries. So, we have scientists in virtually every country that we work in. And so as we've grown, we've had to build up our science capability, and we believe that having scientists helps us ground the priorities that we have in real science work. And so we take the work that they do, and then we have staff of lawyers and conservation practitioners and other people who stewardship people who manage land. We have about 1,300 nature preserves throughout the US that we take care of, that we devote to having people who are on the ground managers of those properties. And so the scientists we have, form the basis of the work that we do, as I mentioned.
A question here is the extent to which cost-benefit analysis is utilized in the decisions made at the Conservancy.
Well, every project is undertaken with an analysis of what the cost of the project is and what the conservation benefit is. So we use that analysis, and what we try to do is try to get the biggest bang for our buck. And so we use that as an analysis to identify the projects. But then another step in the process of trying to decide what projects to undertake is whether or not we can identify a source of funding to be able to pay for those projects. And as I mentioned, the projects that have been in more recent years in which we've had to raise multiple millions of dollars, we've had to mount fundraising campaigns and identify, huge dollars to be able to come up with the money needed to acquire the Belize project, for example, 260,000 acres of land. So there are a number of other factors, not just cost benefit, that go into the decision to undertake a particular project, including, as I mentioned, whether or not we have the resources to manage the project once we've actually been able to acquire it.
Well, in that connection, do you have any measure of the magnitude of the tax benefit, reduced federal revenues from environmental easements that the Conservancy work has generated?
Well, yes, actually, that's an interesting question. There's now a little bit of a controversy in the conservation community with people trying to use the tax benefits of conservation easements to attract very high net worth individuals to use conservation easements solely for their tax benefit. And in recent years, that has caused an increase in the amount of money that's lost to the Treasury because of those people taking advantage of the tax benefits that are available. So the conservation community is concerned about that trend. We have mounted an effort to try to get new legislation passed that would curtail the use and abuse of the tax benefit of conservation easements. We are trying to make sure that landowners who are motivated by purely charitable motives to protect their land for their conservation outcomes are able to benefit from those tax benefits that are incentivizing landowners to protect their land. I don't have the exact statistics, but many more people are taking advantage of that, and it's very concerning to the conservation community.
Well, in the realm of tax policy, and I believe you're a tax attorney by training, this must be a very difficult issue when revenues have fallen, tax cuts, all the rest of that. These are, I guess the term is tax expenditures.
Correct. Yeah.
And for every dollar of tax expenditure, somebody else has to make that up, or we cut taxes and we do less with our government. So it must be quite a challenge. If you have 500 scientists on staff, do you have an advocacy arm?
Yeah, well, the Nature Conservancy has a very large government relations staff as well, in addition to our scientists. So back in the day, we used to pride ourselves not on being a lobbying or advocacy group, but we do advocate and try to use the legislative process to advocate for appropriations and tax incentives for conservation, and to secure more resources to be devoted to our conservation activity. But we are not one of the organizations that goes out to use the court system to litigate our conservation to achieve our conservation goals. We are actually trying to use private sector strategies and conservation transactions to achieve our goals. But we do have a large government relations and public policy staff and an increasing public policy staff, because we believe that using public policy will help shape the enabling conditions for conservation. And so that's a very important part of our strategy.
A question from Elizabeth. Evie, does the Conservancy work internationally? I think we know that's true. She saw some giraffes, so I rather gather Africa is on your map. Brazil?
Yes, we have big programs in Africa and in Brazil, and I was just on a call with a project in trying to help our colleagues in Brazil to protect an area called the Pantanal, which is one of the world's largest wetlands, and it's a very significant ecological area. So yes, we work definitely in those areas.
We're getting down to the end here of the time for questions. Nancy asked if you made mention of the disparity of African Americans' use of parks. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, well, some of you may have read the story in the Times last year in which a Black man was accused of assaulting a white person falsely in Central Park in New York. And that's an example of situations where the Black community sometimes feels less comfortable in spending time in nature than other people, and it's something that the Nature Conservancy is concerned about, and is part of the work we are doing in cities, is to work with disadvantaged communities, the Black communities, to try to help them accomplish conservation activities in their cities. And so either expanding parks or making programs in urban parks more accessible to members of the Black community. So that is, when I mentioned that we have a cities program, that's the focus of the work that we're doing there.
Alice Weinstein wonders if the U.S. government contributes to these projects, and if so, in what proportion?
Well, I don't have the exact proportion, but I can say that, and I wouldn't use the word contributes. We work in partnership with the government. In some cases, we will do what's called a government co-op project, in which we will buy land in advance of the government having the funds to acquire the property to add to a national wildlife refuge or a national forest. And when the government is able to secure an appropriation from Congress to that agency to buy the land, we are then able to transfer that property and get repaid for the expenses that we incurred in buying the land on the government's behalf. So we do a number of projects in cooperation with the government. It wouldn't be, it's not in a contribution. The contribution, I guess, is in the form of our services that we provide to handle the transaction and help the government accomplish its purpose in adding to the wildlife refuge or the national forest.
Everything about the Conservancy seems very large in terms of its activity and its staff and resources. Am I correct that when you value all of the lands protected and other resources that have been protected, we're talking in billions of dollars, maybe $6-7 billion?
Yes, you're close. I think the last figure I recall was that the land assets that the Nature Conservancy owns in our preserve system are about $4 billion worth of land. We have an operating budget each year of $800 million. So you're correct when you say that we're a very large, complicated organization. So it's quite, and for somebody like me who's worked there for 40 years, having had the benefit and pleasure of and honor of working there, I've seen the growth from a very small organization to a very large, complicated organization. But hopefully the scale of our resources is trying to match the scale of our impact. And we're trying to make sure that we're devoting our resources to the most important challenges facing nature and people.
Can we localize this a little bit? Can you tell us, as Rona Foster asks, about projects involving the Potomac and the Chesapeake Bay?
Yes, well, the Conservancy has worked to protect areas along the Potomac River. We had a project in the Maryland, DC chapter. I should have said that we have chapters in virtually every state. And one of the chapters that we have is in Maryland, and it covers Maryland and the District of Columbia. They had a program to protect the Potomac Gorge. And now some of that work has been transferred to the Potomac Conservancy, and the Potomac Conservancy is a separate organization, but we work in cooperation with it. And we're always trying to protect land at the headwaters of the Potomac River. In the Chesapeake, we have helped a number of organizations acquire land. We have preserves on the eastern shore in Nassawango Creek and the Nanacoke Preserve, all of which are protecting lands and waters that flow into Chesapeake Bay to try to ensure that the Chesapeake Bay has clean water. And more recently, we've been doing aquaculture projects to bring back the oyster industry in Chesapeake Bay as a way of helping to improve the resources of the bay.
Well, I think that's about the time we have, Philip, and I'm going to let Nancy take care of the gratitude department here.
Oh, I think Phyllis will do it, but were there any more questions though? We could possibly do one more question if you think there was something that you wanted to ask, Sid.
Well, I'll just get personal. Philip, what do you do to enjoy nature personally? What is your kind of activity that makes it really meaningful for you?
There's two things I would point to. We're fortunate because we live across the street from Glover Park. And so I end up spending time walking through Glover Park and enjoying the benefits of that area. And then another thing we do is I spend a lot of time up in Cape Cod, and I really enjoy spending time on the Cape Cod National Seashore. So we are enjoying the benefits of a lot of the publicly protected areas. And so you know, we're very fortunate where we live, and you know, I'm just very fortunate to have had the career I've had, working on the tangible conservation benefits that have resulted from my efforts.
I can take it from here. Thank you, Sid. And thank you, Philip. That was a really interesting presentation. I learned so much about TNC and its efforts. For the group and Sid, we have recorded the presentation, and it should be available on the Temple website under YouTube's in a week or so, maybe 2, but keep looking for it. And if you don't see it, let us know, and we'll put a little push on that.
If there's an urgency, just send me a message and I'll give you the direct link.
Yeah, it works really well. Philip, you mentioned that you were looking at how the pandemic has affected how we are interacting with nature. Living near the Potomac, I can vouch for how busy the trails were, even in the early days of our lockdowns. I've also noticed that nature definitely has come to us. Last spring, my neighbors noticed the increase in the number of animals in the area. Of course, this is while everyone was staying at home during the day. Maybe they just took the time to see the animals that always roam nearby. And just this week, a black bear has been wandering through the neighborhood. Again, thank you for educating us and for all the work that you and TNC do. As always, we also want to thank you, the participants, for supporting Lunch and Learn, especially during the last year. I enjoy reading and hearing your questions to help us all explore our presentation subjects. Also to David for keeping our virtual environment running smoothly and replying so calmly to our various questions, suggestions, and requests. Other thank yous to Francie for providing readings and thoughts each month, and to Barbara and Jerry for the various administrative tasks that they tackle. We will be dividing into breakout groups in a few minutes. But first, let me tell you about our speaker for June. Jonathan Weissman will be talking about anti-Semitism after Trump, what we've learned since Semitism was published. Jonathan Weiss is deputy Washington editor at New York Times. He has worked as a journalist for 30 years and has reported for the Baltimore Sun, USA Today, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, as well as the New York Times. Semitism was published in 2018 after Donald Trump's election and the Pittsburgh synagogue massacre. In it, Jonathan explores his Jewish identity and the rise of the alt-right and the roots in older anti-Semitic organizations. Next month, he is going to update his insights and proposals. Please register by Monday, June 7th, so that we can assure you will get the Zoom link.